Hey folks, I love consuming. I love spending countless dollars on countless products that I don't really need. Because why have money when I can just not have it? In fact, I love consuming so much, I bought a new apartment. Now I have plenty of space for my 3 Keurigs. Do you think I bought them because I needed that much coffee? No, I bought them because it was fun. There comes a time in every gamer's life where they get into retro stuff. Like one day you're 12 years old and you're a big fan of owning a broken 3DS, but then you hear gaming YouTubers waxing nostalgic about the Sega Dreamcast and you're like, what? So, little known fact, video games existed before 2007. There's an absolutely enormous catalog of games, big and small, spanning decades, some of the most important and influential titles of all time, dating all the way back to the early Jurassic period. But unfortunately, these were titles that I and a lot of other people who grew up in the 2000s missed out on. I grew up in the heyday of the Wii and the DS, and I was happy that way, but that isn't to say I didn't dabble in older titles from time to time. One of the first retro games I got my hands on was Pokemon Fire Red for the Game Boy Advance, as the DS was still compatible with GBA titles. It stopped working 10% of the way through the game. The second retro game I tried was Pokemon Leaf Green for the Game Boy Advance, which also didn't work. Old Pokemon games are notorious for having a bunch of fake bootleg copies in circulation, and as you might expect, they have their fair share of issues, such as stopping working 10% of the way through the game. They can be kinda tricky to tell apart from the real deal, but there are a couple main ways to spot them. The most obvious is the front label sticker. For example, if it looks like this, yeah, it's probably fake. You can see here on my copy of Leaf Green that the Nintendo seal of quality and the ESRB rating look a little bit different from that of a legitimate cartridge. Official copies also have a copyright year, a Nintendo, and a model number written just above the pins on the bottom of the cartridge. They're not immediately obvious, but they're fairly easy to read if you angle the cartridge in the right way. Perhaps the most surefire method of checking whether your cartridge is real, though, is the magical golden rectangle made out of 4 smaller rectangles on the circuit board, which is visible on the top left of the back of the cartridge. Leaf Green flunks on all 3 tests, so it's obviously a fake, but my copy of Fire Red actually looks to be authentic. I suppose I can try booting it up for old time's sake. Who the hell is Drew? What happened to my copy of Fire Red? Okay, so I swear on my life I had a copy of Fire Red that just would not work, but apparently now I have a copy belonging to someone named Drew who managed to get all 8 badges, but I don't know who the hell Drew is or why they only have 4 Pokemon in their PC. I would have to assume that I got rid of the broken Fire Red cartridge and got a new one, or that the cartridge always had this file on it and I was just starting a new game and it was broken for some other reason. But see, this is the problem with trying to remember things from when you were a kid. You don't. Some Pokemon GBA games that I had a little more success playing legitimately, though, are Sapphire and Emerald. Interestingly enough, both files have a player named May with 96 Pokemon in the Pokedex. My copy of Emerald previously belonged to someone else, and I just continued their file. If I recall correctly, I picked up the adventure shortly before battling Rayquaza. The previous owner of the cartridge also seems to have dicked around with cheat codes a lot, as they have an infinite number of Pokeballs and TMs. Made catching the legendaries pretty easy though. My Sapphire copy, on the other hand, was all me. You can tell because my starter's nickname is just awesome. It's also pretty easy to tell that I was still in my newbie Pokemon era when I beat this game, the time when I didn't know or care about any of the deep mechanics or putting an effort to build a good balanced team, aka the time when I was still uncorrupted. This resulted in me basically trying to sweep the main story of this game and others with just 1 or 2 Pokemon. You can see here I have my starter, of course, and a Crobat that I grinded to level 100 because I had nothing better to do, while everyone else in my party is many levels lower. For a while after I beat the game, I used to just battle the Elite Four over and over again, at first to grind up my Crobat, and then to reap the rewards of grinding up my Crobat, and it looks like that's what I was doing before I turned off the game the last time I played it. That was it for my early days of retro gaming experiences, and obviously it took on a distinctly Pokemon tinge. This trend would continue a few years later when I got my next retro game, Pokemon XD Gale of Darkness for the GameCube. I didn't own a GameCube at the time, but fortunately the Wii is backwards compatible with GameCube games. Rather unfortunately, I realized after getting Gale of Darkness that I needed a memory card for it to function, so cue a few more painful days of waiting. But soon enough, my memory card came, and at long last I could play it for 15 minutes and never touch it again. From there, it would be another long while before I picked up any more retro products, until one day a retro game vendor with a GameCube for sale caught my eye at the state fair. One impulsive purchase later, and I was on a one-way ticket to GameCube City, along with a copy of Super Smash Bros. Melee. Melee was $60, which isn't a terrible price, and just about matches the average price of Melee in the case for the last couple of years, save for the time that it conveniently dipped to around $40 right at the time when I bought it for $60. Awesome. This occasion marked my very first retro console that I ever owned. Do you want to guess what I did with it? I did mess around with it for a little bit, but it was more just to make sure the system and its games functioned rather than actually having any meaningful experience with them. But still, it was a pretty big occasion, or depending on your interpretation, the point of no return. When you've never owned it yourself, retro consoles just have such a mythical quality to them, like this rare lost relic that only a chosen few can possess for themselves, so it just felt so cool to finally hold one in my hands for the first time. It would be another little while before I set my sights on my next console, this time the Nintendo 64. On the day I bought the GameCube, the vendor also had an N64 for sale, and I had a pretty tough time deciding between the two, but after choosing the GameCube, the N64 was the clear choice for my next console purchase. I got it alongside Banjo-Kazooie and GoldenEye 007, and I got a bit more mileage out of them than I did with my GameCube. Both of them were solid titles, and I had quite a bit of fun messing around with them, though I didn't get very far in either of them before I moved on to other things. But don't worry, I do plan on coming back to finish them. You know, eventually. About a year later, I got a Game Boy Advance SP, which actually came in the original box, which was a really nice surprise as I was expecting to just get the system by itself. There is something about old console boxes that I find really interesting. I think it just adds to the immersion of putting you in the shoes of someone who owned the system back in its prime. But as for the GBA itself, I tested it out to see if it worked, and goodbye GBA. So, after buying 3 retro consoles in a row and getting barely any playtime out of them, what was my next conclusion? I need more. Basically, I realized that I had free will and that my bank account was too big and my backlog was too small, so I started to develop a kick for snatching up more and more retro games. Although it would obviously be a while before I played any of them, 1, my backlog was already comically large, so a few more games couldn't hurt, and 2, to a decent extent, my desire to get more retro games was based heavily on the collecting aspect. Simply having all these games on my shelf was a really exciting prospect, regardless of when I actually got to playing them. One of my first big retro game purchasing escapades was going on a mad romp with one of my friends through a bunch of retro game stores in the local area. It's a really cool experience getting to see this massive assortment of not only retro games, but a lot of retro gaming merchandise and accessories. It's fun to just be in there with all these gaming relics and appreciate the true depth of gaming history. After this adventure, I came home with a pretty sizable haul of cool stuff. Some highlights include physical copies of the Orange Box for PS3 and Xbox 360, neither of which I own. Yeah, it's not the most practical purchase, but even if I did own either of these systems, I'd much rather play these games on a computer anyway, and really the only reason I got these games was so that I could own a physical copy or two of Team Fortress 2, since it is a pretty important game to me. Some other highlights include Glover, Punch-Out, Resident Evil 4, A Link to the Past and 4 Swords, and the crown jewel, Barnyard for GBA, because how could I resist? Not too long after that, the perhaps biggest consumption fest of my life rolled around. Video game conventions. I went to a nifty little gaming convention the past 2 summers in which a big highlight was spending money on products. Who could have guessed? On top of some merchandise and other knickknacks, the main thing I bought was, unsurprisingly, old games. It was really cool to browse for hours through various vendors' collections, looking through a massive volume of video game history and seeing a bunch of rare stuff that I'd never seen in person before. It was here that I nearly completed my Pokemon game collection, with every game up through Generation 6 now except for Ruby. I even got Pokemon Red in a box, which was on sale for $200. I asked if they'd take $180, they said $185, I said sure, then paid a $5 credit card fee, so I saved $10 on Pokemon Red in a box that looks like this. Listen, some people spend their money on vapes. This was, I think, my dumbest purchase, but the price isn't terrible compared to what a game-in-box set typically goes for, and even though it's a pretty shit box, it's still cool to at least have a box. Speaking of Pokemon boxes, I also got myself a Pokemon Platinum box for $40, which is a dogshit terrible price if you think about how the complete game and box originally retailed for that much, but that actually isn't a bad price compared to what it typically goes for, and given that Platinum is my favorite game of all time, I'd say the box was worth getting. This, of course, raises the question of, if it's my favorite game of all time, why don't I already own the box? And the reason for that, as is the reason for many things, is that my younger self was an idiot. I just didn't realize that game cases would be valuable as collector's items, or that cases like Platinums would have particular sentimental value later on in life. I'm not sure if I actually threw the cases away or if one of my parents did, but I definitely didn't take good care of them or keep a close eye on them, so now they're either in a landfill somewhere or just hopelessly lost and most likely gone forever. So even though it's kinda dumb that I even needed to buy a new Platinum case in the first place, finally getting my hands on one again felt pretty darn good. Some other highlights of my convention escapades include Smash 64 and Perfect Dark in the original boxes, Donkey Kong Jungle Beat with the bongos, and the crown jewel, Barnyard for GameCube, because how could I resist? And that's it as far as my personal experiences with retro game collecting, but what about the overall experience on a more general level? What's it like to go through the process of searching for old games? Well, if you want to experience some retro titles, you have a couple options, one of which being not buying them at all. There are a decent chunk of ways now to experience retro games without having to go out and buy the original discs and cartridges. These ways include things like the Virtual Console, the Nintendo Switch Online collections, and various ports and re-releases. They are generally perfectly fine ways to play old games, and typically at a much better price point than that of the original games, not to mention the cost of buying old consoles and any necessary accessories. They also usually offer some quality of life features such as rewinding and save states, which are especially handy for a lot of older games where you weren't able to save without passwords or weren't able to save at all. That all being said, I think there are some ways in which these versions of retro games can detract from the overall experience. It can sometimes feel sort of awkward or unintuitive to play these games using controllers that they weren't designed for, and there sometimes may be slight differences that make the re-release not quite the original experience, although how much that matters is obviously up to personal preference. But more generally, it just doesn't quite feel the same as actually owning the original game and console and controller. Even if a retro game functions just fine in a re-released form, I think there is a certain magic to using the original hardware. It lets you experience what it might have been like for someone back in the day to actually play a given retro game for the first time, and it can give you a lot greater appreciation for the game and the system that it's on. And of course, if you care about owning the original physical cartridges for their value as novelties and collectibles, then yeah, buying the originals is obviously the way to go. But that all being said, the cost of getting legitimate retro games and consoles can be pretty prohibitive, and if all you really care about is playing the games in some form, then getting a re-released version is obviously the way to go, as it's going to save you a decent chunk of time and money. Another option for playing old games for cheap is emulating them on your computer like a filthy criminal. I, of course, have never emulated a game on my computer myself because I would never do such a heinous thing, but if I had to guess, I'd say that it's a pretty handy option for playing old games and is actually how I played through Pokemon Fire Red all the way through for the first time. Computer emulation can offer a lot of benefits such as save states, a speed-up function, visual enhancements, and even mods and hacks. You also have more options for customizing your gameplay experience, as you can configure button inputs to work with a keyboard and mouse and various external controllers if you're able to connect them to your computer. And perhaps best of all, emulation of old games is completely free. The main limitation of emulation is that your computer needs to be powerful enough to run a lot of these games smoothly. For simple stuff like Game Boy and Game Boy Advance games, you can get by with some pretty crappy hardware, but for stuff like the DS or GameCube or Wii, you're gonna need a decent computer to get them to function. So if your computer is a piece of garbage, then playing the original games or official re-releases is the better option. Moreover, just like with re-releases, emulation has the issue of it just not feeling the same as playing the legitimate game on legitimate hardware. But also like with re-releases, if all you care about is playing the game in some form for cheap, emulation is an easy winner. However, if you do care about actually owning the original games and consoles, one option for doing so is just buying them online, which definitely works, but isn't really my favorite method. Buying retro games and systems online can be pretty convenient, as you can easily compare prices between multiple sellers, make purchases from the comfort of your own home, and get them delivered right to your door. However, depending on where you get them from, there is a definite risk of the game or console you get being fake, broken, or having some physical defect that wasn't shown in the online listing. That being said, I got Pokemon XD, Banjo-Kazooie, GoldenEye 007, and my Nintendo 64 itself by ordering online, and they had no problems at all, and as long as you're careful about whom or where you buy from, you can reduce your risk of getting scammed significantly. But the main drawback of online shopping for me is that going to a physical store is just so much more fun. As I've mentioned, being in an actual physical store is such a fascinating experience, getting to see such an expansive catalog of classic titles and gaming memorabilia. It's quite a bit of fun to browse through all the shelves and search for that one game that you just have to have or find interesting stuff that you hadn't thought about before. Not to mention, it's helpful to support small businesses that keep retro games and gaming history accessible to the wider community. Now imagine going to like 50 retro game stores all at once. That is a convention. As I've explained, it's really exciting to comb through a seemingly infinite collection of various classic games, consoles, and accessories, and conventions full of various vendors can provide you the opportunity to pick up something rare that you haven't been able to find elsewhere. Although one unfortunate thing I noticed is that oftentimes the prices for stuff at the convention were a decent bit higher than what you could generally find them for online and elsewhere. It kinda makes sense, it probably costs the vendors a decent amount to keep their shops operational and not to mention haul their stuff over to a convention, but it definitely put a bit of a damper on the shopping experience, realizing that although a lot of the stuff they were selling was pretty cool, I could just get it somewhere else for a better price, and there wasn't really any point for me to get it there. But I was still able to find a decent amount of vendors whose prices were close to or better than what I was seeing online, and I'd generally rather buy from them as it's nice to support retro game shops and I can actually inspect things in person so that I know what I'm getting. And besides, walking out of a convention with a big stack of games gives me dopamine. So those were some of the ins and outs of acquiring retro games. Searching for them is an interesting experience, and there are a lot of different approaches you can take to filling up your collection. It can be fun to explore online and in-person stores and finally track down something you've wanted for a long time, or discover something new that you didn't know you wanted. And even if you're not interested in getting the original products, just being able to play them at all can be a fun experience that offers you a glimpse into gaming history. Whether you play old games through re-releases and emulation just for the sake of experiencing them, or if you prefer to hunt down the original cartridges and consoles and add them to your collection, the process of searching for retro games is reflective of a love for gaming as a medium. For me personally, video games are a major hobby of mine, and so getting retro games is a way for me to dive deeper into the world of video games and gain a greater appreciation of its history. So no matter how you experience retro games or how much time and money you put into them, at least you didn't buy this box.